Hello. In this hopefully short video segment, I'm going to try to discuss what's called the circular flow model. Usually, this is the first model you do in a Principles of Economics class, micro or macro. Today, we're going to discuss how an economy works as a whole. This model is very simple. It's nice because it teases out a lot of terms that we can use throughout an entire semester. And the other nice thing about it is it's just a little bit fun. So, even more fun than some other models like aggregate supply, aggregate demand, or consumer choice theory and stuff like that. It's even more fun than those. So here we go. Now, we can start any number of places because at the end of the day, this thing will be, as it's described, circular. So let's go ahead and start with one entity in the circular flow model. This is an entity, households. Let me give you a brighter color than that so it stands out. Households, HH. Clearly, we are referring to households. That's a door. So that's one entity in our circular flow model. That's typically what we think of as like you and me, right? What do households do in an economy? Well, they do a couple of things. A couple of actions, a couple of verbs are done by households. One thing that households do is buy stuff. Right? We buy goods and services. So that is one market in which households participate in. One of really two markets that households participate in. So let's document that little fact that we're all familiar with. Households buy goods and services. And where do we buy that? In a market, as I said, it's called the market for want to guess? Goods and services. So we buy stuff, but there's something missing. They don't just come to us, as is illustrated here. We have to buy it. We don't really love that part. What do we call what we have to do to get these goods and services? What, in lay terms, when we're talking to our friends or families, when we buy something, what do we say we have to do? We say we have to spend money. We don't really love that part of the transaction, do we? So we call it spending. And that's what we're going to call it here in this flow. This is the circular flow model. So far, we have illustrated some flow. That is a G for spending. Okay, a wide-tailed G. That is a G. Oh my goodness, that's a rough G. I can fix it. There we go. So that's happening, but that cannot be all that's happening, can it? It's not very circular. You could say it's circular in the sense that something's going this way, something's going this way, but there's no connection at the end to bring anything back. If this continued, eventually we would be out of money and we'd have all the goods and services that were in the goods and services market, but there must be something more. And what more is there is that these goods and services come from somewhere. From where do goods and services come? Firms. That's our other entity. Firms produce the goods and services that we consume. But before I can get there, I have a nice little illustration for households. So why don't I do one for firms? This is going to be some of my best artwork, I am sure. Let's see. This is clearly a hammer, interrupted by a wrench. So that's a crisscrossing hammer and wrench. You know why? Because firms make stuff. There are other entity of our two entities that we're examining in our simplest form of the circular flow model. This thing can be much more elaborate than what we're going to do here. It really can. We could include government, we could include trade, but today, what we're doing, this is all we need. And so, as I mentioned, goods and services come from these firms, so we get to use the same label on this arm. Now, these labels on these arms, you do want to actually commit to your memory. They're not just aesthetically pleasing like my artwork. They are telling of a specific thing. Watch this. These are goods and services, so I'm going to abbreviate with G&S. I think everybody gets that. But now, do firms say, at their among the presidents, vice presidents, the partnerships, the sole proprietorships talking to their spouses, do they say, oh, we need some more household spending to make these goods and services? Is that what they call it? Is that how they view it? The spending that we are doing? Do they say, spend more? That's not really, from their point of view, that's not really what that money is that they're receiving for their goods and services. From their point of view, that's called revenue. It's the same money, different name because of the context. It's the payment for goods and services received by the firms, the payment for goods and services coming from the households. We view that as spending. Same money, different context. Same goods and services, of course, too. That's coming from them going to us. And this thing is called the circular flow model. The flow is becoming clear. The fact it's a simplification of reality, the model is becoming clear. What's not yet with us is this aspect of circular. You might think, well, it's going this way, so it's circular, but we don't have everything. If this were everything, ultimately all the goods and services would be over there, and all the money would be over there, and things would just come to a grinding halt. That can't be. That doesn't happen. So something else must go on. Let's go back to my original question. What do households do? Households buy stuff. Is that all we do? Not most of us. Most of us do something else. Most of us go to work. We provide something that makes those goods and services, don't we? Labor is one thing that comes from the households that makes those goods and services that the households ultimately get to enjoy when they spend their money. Now, how do we spend the money? Why do we go to work? Well, we do that for income. And that's what we call it. That's our income. Now, that part hopefully is clear. Everybody watching this probably has a sense of labor, but we actually provide more in the production of these goods and services than just labor. Since we have private property rights, we also provide the natural resources that go into the production of goods and services, and that's called land. So we provide the land that's necessary to make goods and services and all the natural resources that are necessary to make goods and services. Ultimately, they come from, quote unquote, the people or the households to make those things happen, in addition to the labor that puts those things together. And then there's a third part that we provide. In some contexts, some textbooks, there are arguments for a fourth part, and I can touch on that as well. But the third part that we provide, this is a term that we can use as we do in lay terms in this model. Most of the time in economics, we cannot use this term the same way that we do as the quote-unquote man on the street. And what I'm referring to is capital. Capital is property, plant, and equipment, tools, stuff that makes stuff. Here, we can use it as it's typically used in lay terms, where we're talking about financial capital. Because to have a business making stuff, someone has to put forward the money to get the thing going before the revenue can pay to have the stuff made. And that comes from households, some proprietor somewhere, or even shareholders among households somewhere. These are the people who are putting forward their money in order to gain more income for themselves. Now, some textbooks also add entrepreneurship to this. And entrepreneurship is essentially the willingness to risk, to take risk, because that's what happens here, right? In order to put forward your financial capital, you're risking losing it. because you don't know if a firm's going to be successful when you do that. And so some textbooks consider this another factor of production in this market, which has numerous names in different textbooks. It's the market for the factors of production. Also called the resource market, factors market, probably some other names, all synonymous. It's the inputs that we're talking about that go into making stuff. Some textbooks include entrepreneurship as an input itself. It's certainly necessary to have an entrepreneurship spirit in an economy for people to put forward that capital and to take that financial risk for stuff to get made. Now, firms, when they buy this stuff from us, the households, they don't say, let's give them some income. No. From their point of view, they're paying for these inputs, these factors, and they have bills for these things that they have to pay. So the payment to labor has a specific name. That is wages. The payment to capital has a specific name too. Why do when people buy shares of stock, one way they get compensated for taking that financial risk is the share price can rise, or the firm can give them a slice of their earnings, which is called profit. And a sole proprietor opens a business, and what's left after paying all the other expenses is that sole proprietor's profit. So firms pay for factors of production so far: wages, profit, and the payment to land. I don't have a good story for this. I don't have some tie-in. The payment to land is called rent, and that's not too hard to remember, because when we pay to have an apartment or something, we pay what's called rent. But any payment to land or natural resources is called rent. And that's an arrow, and it's becoming muddled with my rent, but that's an arrow. And these are the things that firms need to make goods and services. So they pay for them individually, but to them, these are just their inputs or their factors of production that it takes to make stuff. And now we have a full, complete cycle or circle where stuff continues to get made for revenue, which goes back to households, which in some becomes households' income, which does what? Pay for the stuff that gets made. So that is the circular flow model.